Imagine being locked inside a steel box. The engine behind you is screaming at 500 horsepower. The temperature inside is pushing past 130 degrees Fahrenheit. You can barely see through a slit the size of a letterbox. And somewhere out there, a German anti-tank gun is looking for you. Now add one more detail. If that shell hits, you have approximately 3 seconds to get out before the ammunition inside your tank turns everything into a fireball. And your escape hatch? It opens inward, into the same space you're trying to escape from. This is what it meant to be a T-34 driver. And today we're going to tell you exactly why. Despite being one of the most feared tanks of World War II, the T-34 was also a machine that killed its own crews in ways the Germans never had to. Let's start with something that sounds almost too absurd to be true, because it is true, and it killed people. To shift gears in a T-34, drivers regularly needed a hammer. Not metaphorically, an actual hammer. Soviet drivers carried one inside the tank specifically to beat the gear lever hard enough to force a gear change. The transmission on early T-34 models was so poorly designed, so stiff, and so prone to locking up under stress that drivers couldn't physically move it with hand strength alone during combat. Think about what that means in practice. You're driving at full speed toward an enemy position. You need to change direction. You need to slow down. You reach for the gear lever and it won't move. So you grab your hammer, you swing it against the lever while the tank is moving, while shells are landing around you, while your commander is screaming in your ear, and you pray the gear catches before something worse happens. This wasn't a rare manufacturing defect. This was so common and so widely known that Soviet training manuals and veterans' accounts both confirm it. Drivers expected it. They trained for it. They packed their hammer the same way they packed their rations. The transmission had 4 forward gears and 1 reverse, and even under ideal conditions it required enormous physical strength to operate. Drivers described their hands bleeding after long engagements from the sheer force needed to work the clutch and levers through extended combat. After hours of driving across rough terrain, some drivers simply lost the strength to shift at all. And a tank that can't change gears in combat is, very shortly, a destroyed tank. Soviet engineers knew about this problem. It was reported constantly. The fix came eventually with improved transmissions later in the war. But for the drivers of 1941 and 1942, when Germany was tearing through Soviet lines and tank crews were being thrown into combat with sometimes less than 2 weeks of training, the hammer was the solution. Now let's talk about the space these men were actually working in, because it's important to understand just how inhuman the T-34's interior was before we get to what happened when things went wrong. The driver sat in the front left of the hull with his legs stretched forward into a tunnel barely wide enough to accommodate them. The seat didn't adjust in any meaningful way. Taller drivers, anything above 5'8" or so, had difficulty fitting at all without their head pressing against the roof. The controls were arranged not for ergonomic efficiency, but because of where the mechanical components happened to end up. The clutch pedal required leg strength that most people simply don't have after a few hours of continuous use. Veterans described their legs shaking uncontrollably after long drives, not from fear, but from pure physical exhaustion. Visibility was catastrophically limited. The driver had a single periscope and a small forward-facing vision slit. In early models, that slit was the primary way to see during combat because commanders frequently ordered drivers to close everything down when under fire. Through that slit, the effective field of vision was roughly what you'd see through a mail slot in a door. Drivers learned to navigate by instinct, by the movement of the tank beneath them, and by shouted instructions from the commander above, who himself had limited visibility. Coordination between commander and driver required both men to develop an almost physical language of taps, shouts, and pressure signals, because the intercom systems in early T-34s were either absent or unreliable. In many crews, the radio was in the commander's hands and the driver heard nothing but engine noise and the sound of shells hitting the hull. The noise inside a T-34 at full speed was described by survivors as genuinely painful. The V2 diesel engine directly behind the driver produced not just sound but vibration that traveled through the entire hull. Conversations were impossible. Commands were misheard. Decisions that needed to happen in seconds were delayed because a driver simply couldn't hear what the commander was telling him. And then there was the heat. The engine compartment was separated from the crew by a firewall, but heat transferred continuously. Combined with the body heat of 2 or more crew members in a sealed metal box in summer conditions, temperatures inside the fighting compartment during extended operations could reach levels that caused heat exhaustion. Drivers have described losing focus, losing concentration, making navigation errors not because they were bad soldiers but because their bodies were being cooked. But all of that, the hammer, the heat, the noise, the cramped controls, all of that becomes secondary when you understand what happened when a T-34 was hit. And they were hit. Constantly. In the early years of the war, German anti-tank crews knew the T-34's weaknesses better in some ways than the Soviets themselves did. When an armor-piercing shell penetrated a T-34, the effect inside was immediate and catastrophic. The shell itself, or the spall it created, fragments of the inner hull traveling at lethal velocity in every direction, would kill or wound crew members instantly. Fuel and ammunition would ignite within seconds. And here is where the design failure becomes something almost unforgivable. The T-34's escape hatches were among the worst of any major tank of the war. Early production T-34s had a single large 2-piece hatch on the turret designed to be opened by both the commander and loader simultaneously. In practice, if one crew member was killed or wounded, the other often couldn't open it alone from the inside. The hatch mechanism was heavy. It required 2 hands, and it opened in a way that demanded physical space that an injured soldier frequently didn't have. The driver's hatch was in the hull, directly in front of the driver's position. In theory, simple enough. In practice, it opened inward. An inward opening hatch in a burning tank means that a driver trying to escape has to pull a heavy steel hatch toward himself, into the space he's trying to move through, while the tank fills with smoke and fire. If he's been injured, if his arms aren't working fully, if there's any debris blocking the hatch, he's not getting out. Post-war Soviet studies and German battlefield reports both documented a consistent and grim pattern. T-34s destroyed in combat were frequently found with crew members still inside. Not because the men didn't try to escape, because they couldn't. German tank crews, by contrast, had hatches specifically engineered for rapid emergency egress. The lesson had been learned earlier, built into the design at the engineering level. Soviet tank design prioritized armor, firepower, and mobility. The survivability of the crew inside was, to put it plainly, a lower priority. There's a specific situation that made this even more lethal, and it has a name that Soviet tankers knew well. Brewing up. When a T-34 was penetrated and the ammunition ignited, the tank didn't just burn. The ammunition cooked off, detonating round after round in rapid succession. In the worst cases, the turret was blown completely off the hull by the force of the internal explosions. The time between penetration and catastrophic ammunition detonation was sometimes measured in seconds. That's not enough time to fight a stuck hatch. Now here's where it gets complicated, and it's important to say this honestly. Soviet crews knew all of this. They knew the transmission was brutal. They knew the hatches were dangerous. They knew the visibility was terrible and the noise was overwhelming and the heat was unbearable. And they drove those tanks anyway. Part of that was because they had no choice. The Soviet military system in 1941 and 1942 didn't offer its soldiers many alternatives. Refusal wasn't an option. Hesitation could be interpreted as cowardice, and in the Red Army of those years, cowardice had consequences that went well beyond a court-martial. There are documented cases of Soviet officers shooting their own men for retreating without orders. The system that sent these crews into battle in inadequate machines was the same system that would punish them for refusing to go. But that explanation, while true, is also incomplete, because if you read the accounts carefully, something else comes through alongside the fear and the resignation. These men weren't just obeying orders. Many of them had seen what the German occupation looked like. They had lost family members. Some had watched their villages burn. The war for them wasn't a mission briefing. It was personal in a way that's difficult to fully translate into words decades later. And that matters when you're trying to understand how a man hammers a gear lever into place while shells are landing around him and keeps driving forward. The T-34 had genuine strengths, and the crews who survived long enough knew them intimately. The sloped armor deflected shells that would have gone straight through earlier Soviet tanks. The diesel engine was far less prone to catching fire than the gasoline engines in many German vehicles. They learned how to use the speed, how the armor angle worked in their favor, how to read terrain. But most of that knowledge couldn't come from training. The average Soviet tanker in 1941 had between 2 weeks and 2 months of instruction before combat. The rest had to be learned by surviving. By 1943 and 1944, improvements were finally arriving. Better transmissions. A new wider turret on the T-34-85 with a separate commander's hatch. Better radios, better visibility. The Soviets learned their lessons, but they learned them the brutal way. Paid for by the crews who didn't make it back from the burns and the jammed hatches and the tanks that became furnaces in seconds. There's a detail that says more than almost anything else about what it felt like to drive one. When Lend-Lease tanks arrived from the United States and Britain, Soviet crews noticed something almost immediately. The Allied tanks were easier to escape from. The hatches opened outward. There were more of them. When your tank was hit, your chances of getting out alive were meaningfully better. These were men who knew the T-34's combat advantages with the intimate knowledge of people who had bet their lives on them repeatedly. And what registered when they climbed into a Sherman was the hatch. The way it opened away from them instead of into them. That detail tells you everything about what was living in the back of every driver's mind every time they went into combat. Not just the fear of being killed by the enemy, the fear of surviving the hit itself, only to die because the door wouldn't open. Europe's most produced and arguably most important tank of the Second World War required a hammer to shift gears, cooked its crew in summer, partially blinded its driver in combat, and regularly failed to let them out when everything went wrong. And the men who drove it turned the largest land invasion in human history around and drove it all the way back to Berlin. That's the horror. And also, if you think about it, something close to the opposite of it.